My 3 children kicked me out of the house, so I immediately bought a retirement ranch called Flora's Reach Ranch, sprawling 640 acres, to surprise them. On Thanksgiving night, my greedy 3 children broke into the ranch with a locksmith in hand, whispering, "Cut it, that old man doesn't know, and then we'll take everything." Click. The lock fell, the door swung open, and the lights came on, and they gawked in disbelief at what was inside the room. I could see the panic in their eyes, their screams piercing the quiet night. Welcome to the Dad Vengeance channel. Thank you for being here. It genuinely means something to me. Drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from, city, country? Whatever you feel like sharing. I love knowing who's in the room. A quick note: this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and reflection. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but everything it's trying to say to you matters. It was 7:14 in the evening when the sensor went off. Not a loud sound. Just a soft electronic ping from the laptop on the side table, the kind of sound that on any other night wouldn't mean much. But I had been waiting for that sound for 6 months. So when it came, I didn't move. I didn't reach for the phone. I just picked up the stopwatch sitting on the armrest, pressed the button, and set it face down on my knee. In the living room of Flora's Reach Ranch, 8 of us sat in the dark. No lamps, no overhead lights. Just the faint blue glow of Garrison Lowe's laptop screen in the corner, and the thin slice of moonlight coming through the front window. Nobody spoke. Cornelius Hatch was at the dining table, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a folder of documents closed in front of him. Sheriff Trace Mullen stood near the window, one hand resting on the frame, watching the long gravel driveway that stretched out into the dark. His deputy was posted in the hallway, quiet as furniture. Garrison sat with his laptop monitoring the cloud camera feeds. Miriam Oates had her phone face down on her knee recorder already running. Theron Oglesby, my neighbor, 68 years old, and sharp as a man, half his age, sat in the corner chair with a cup of cold coffee he hadn't touched in an hour. And somewhere in the back room, very still, very quiet, was Priscilla. 8 people, 1 ranch house, 1 plan that had taken 6 months to build. Cornelius broke the silence first. His voice was low, almost conversational. "Right on time," he said. I didn't look up from the stopwatch. "Greed always is," I said, to understand why I was sitting in the dark that Thanksgiving night. Calm, almost smiling. "You need to understand what kind of man my children thought I was." The short version: they thought I was useless. My name is Harlan Doyle. I'm 65 years old. For 40 years, I was a senior geologist and field consultant for the West Texas Petroleum Bureau, a career that took me from the Permian Basin to the Palo Duro Canyon, from the salt flats of Culberson County to formations so deep underground that the pressure alone could crush a car engine. I spent 4 decades learning how to read the earth the way other men read balance sheets. I knew what a particular shade of reddish soil meant. I knew how to look at a topographic map and hear what it was trying to say. But my children didn't know any of that. Or if they did, they'd long since stopped caring. To Desmond, my oldest 42, running a construction company that was drowning in debt, I was a liability. A name on a form. Someone whose assets needed to be restructured before they became a problem. To Vivian, 38, a former model who had traded runways for a social media feed, I was content. Background material. The kind of aging parent you film from a flattering angle for sympathy clicks. And to Sawyer, my youngest, 31, who I'm fairly certain hadn't held a steady job since the Obama administration, I was simply a wallet with a slow leak. I knew what they called me. Word gets around even when you're 65 and supposedly out of the loop. Useless old man burning through his pension. Vivian had even posted a video of it. Not directly, she was smarter than that. It was one of those casual, candid clips she was always filming. She'd come to visit the old house in Midland about 8 months before Flora passed, and she'd filmed me sitting in the kitchen reading the newspaper. A physical newspaper. The old kind, with ink that comes off on your fingers. She'd captioned it something like, "When you realize your dad is still living in 1987. The comments were full of laughing emojis and heart reacts, 230,000 views. Cornelius had saved that video, printed the caption, put it in a folder. Because that's the kind of lawyer Cornelius Hatch is, the kind who understands that humiliation properly documented tells a story. Here's what none of them knew. Flora's Reach Ranch. The 640 acres of West Texas land they were currently pulling up the driveway to seize was not the whole picture. It wasn't even close. For the past 20 years, quietly, methodically, I had been building something they couldn't see because it wasn't in my name. It was held in a series of private trusts, legal structures that, under Texas law, don't require public disclosure of the beneficial owner. Real estate, mineral rights, a small stake in a water infrastructure project outside Pecos. Nothing flashy. Nothing that showed up when you Googled my name. Flora's Reach was the newest addition. The only one I'd let anyone see. That was the point. They thought they were coming for everything I had. They were actually walking into the only door I'd left open because it was the one I'd rigged. Across the room, the laptop pinged again. Garrison looked up and gave a single nod. They were at the gate. I picked up the stopwatch, looked at it. 6 months, 3 days, and about 40 years of patience had led to this moment. They called me useless, I thought. But useless men don't build empires. They just build them quietly. But before I tell you about the empire, let me tell you about the woman who made me want to build it. Her name was Flora, and everything I ever built began with a piece of paper she drew on 40 years ago. I still carry it with me. Right now, if you asked me to, I could reach into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt and pull out a folded square of paper, soft at the edges, slightly yellowed. The kind of fragile that comes from decades of being carried close to a person's body. It's a napkin from a diner in Lubbock, Texas. The name of the place is long gone, but I remember the red vinyl booths and the way the coffee came in those heavy ceramic mugs that were always just a little too hot to hold. It was 1983. We were 24 years old. Flora had borrowed a pencil from the waitress, just walked up to the counter and asked the way she did things, without hesitation, and when she came back to the booth, she didn't say anything. She just started drawing. I watched her work. Small, careful lines. A farmhouse with a long porch. A wide field to the left with short, wavy strokes she labeled in her looping handwriting lavender. A winding path lined with taller shapes, sunflowers, she told me later. A pond in the lower corner with a squiggly shoreline and 2 small triangles she said were ducks. 10 tiny circles scattered across a hillside that might have been sheep or might have been rocks, but she insisted were sheep. A small orchard to the right. Honeycrisp apples, she specified, as if the variety mattered enormously. And on the porch, 2 shapes side by side in a swing, each holding what I assumed was a coffee cup. When she finished, she slid it across the table without a word. I looked at it for a long moment. "That's a lot of lavender," I said. "Along the hillside," she said. Morning light hits it different on a slope. "You've thought about this." "Since I was about 12, she said. And she wasn't joking. In the corner of the napkin, in letters so small, I almost missed them someday. Flora Marin Doyle, née Calloway. Born in Amarillo. Raised in a house where money was something other people had, but she never carried it like a wound. She was a 3rd-grade school teacher for 31 years. She believed truly and without irony that children needed to be seen before they could learn a single thing. She applied that same principle to our marriage, and I was for 38 years the most seen I have ever felt in my life. She was precise, not cold precise. She had a way of naming things exactly as they were without cruelty and without softening. When I was wrong about something, she told me. When I was right, she told me that too. She did not deal in flattery, and she did not deal in silence. She met me at 24 and decided I was worth the trouble, which remains the greatest compliment anyone has ever paid me. She died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2022. Ovarian cancer diagnosed 14 months earlier. She handled the whole thing the way she handled everything practically honestly, without a lot of fuss. She made arrangements. She wrote letters. She told me exactly where she wanted to be buried and exactly what she didn't want people to wear to the service. I was with her at the end, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding her hand, watching the morning light come through the curtains she'd hung in 1998. The funeral was 4 days later. Midland, Texas. A Baptist church she hadn't attended regularly in years. But the congregation came anyway, because people like Flora don't need to show up every Sunday to leave a mark. Desmond arrived 6 hours late. 6 hours. I was standing at the graveside when I heard his rental car in the parking lot. He walked across the grass in dress shoes that were wrong for the terrain, shook my hand, and within 10 minutes had quietly asked whether Flora had left a will and who was handling the estate. I didn't answer him. I just turned back to the grave. Vivienne came on time, which I'll give her. She brought someone with her, a young woman with a phone mounted on a small stabilizer grip, filming the whole thing. Vivienne told me it was for memory. Later, I saw she'd posted a clip to her page. The caption said something about grief and love. It had 47,000 likes by Sunday. Sawyer called me from a number I didn't recognize 2 days before the service. He said he couldn't make it. I asked him why. He said he'd explain later. He never did. I found out through Desmond that Sawyer had taken money from his brother to cover the flight and spent it elsewhere. I don't know on what. I didn't ask. So there I was, standing at my wife's grave on a gray Texas morning, and of the dozen or so people who came, the one who stood closest to me, the one who stayed for the whole service without checking his phone, without saying a word, without needing anything from me, was a man I had never met before in my life. His name was Theron Oglesby. He was 66 years old, a retired Army veteran who owned land out in Reeves County. I still don't know exactly how he heard about Flora. He never fully explained, and after a while I stopped needing him to. He just stood there a few inches to my left, like he'd been assigned to the post and wasn't going anywhere. After the burial, as people started drifting toward their cars, he put a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Good woman," he said. "The best," I said. He nodded once, and that was all. 3 children, 1 stranger, and only one of them understood what it means to show up. 6 months after we buried Flora, Desmond appeared at my front door with a man I didn't know, dressed in a suit, carrying a clipboard, wearing the particular expression of someone who believes he is about to do you a favor. He wasn't. That clipboard changed everything. Not because it scared me, because it finally gave me permission to do what I had been thinking about for years. The man with the clipboard was named Dr. Aldous Brenner, a clinical psychologist out of Odessa, Texas, according to the card he handed me at the door. He was maybe 50, soft-spoken, with the kind of careful neutrality you develop when your job is to evaluate people who don't want to be evaluated. He shook my hand, told me he was there to conduct a routine cognitive assessment, said the word routine the way people say it when nothing about the situation is routine at all. Desmond stood behind him on the porch, hands in his coat pockets, wearing the expression of a man who believes he is doing something generous. I looked at my son for a moment. Then I stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," I said. "I just made coffee." The assessment took about 45 minutes. Dr. Brenner sat across from me at the kitchen table with a legal pad and asked me a series of questions, the standard battery for cognitive evaluation. What year is it? Who is the current president? Count backward from 100 by sevens. Repeat these 5 words back to me in 10 minutes. Draw a clock showing 3:15. I answered every question. Correctly, completely, without hesitation. I drew the clock. I repeated the 5 words. I counted backward without a single error. When it was over, Dr. Brenner looked down at his legal pad for a long moment. "Mr. Doyle," he said carefully, "I don't see any indicators of concern." "No," I said. "I wouldn't expect you to." I looked at Desmond, who was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. "Where do you want to send me, son?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Desmond's expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "Dad," he said, "you need proper care. You're living alone. You're not managing." "Managing what exactly?" He didn't answer that. He never answered the direct questions. That was always his way approach, sideways, retreat when confronted head-on. He'd learned it young and never unlearned it. Dr. Brenner packed up his legal pad. He shook my hand again on the way out. I noticed he didn't make eye contact with Desmond. That night, I called Cornelius Hatch. Cornelius and I go back 30 years. We met through a mutual colleague in the petroleum industry. Back when Cornelius was a young attorney specializing in mineral rights law, and I was running field surveys out of the Permian Basin. He is without question the sharpest legal mind I have ever known personally. He is also the kind of man who answers his phone at 10:30 in the evening without complaint. "They sent a psychologist," I told him. A pause. "For what?" "Cognitive assessment. Capacity evaluation." Another pause, longer this time. "Harlan, that means they're building a case for guardianship." "I know what it means," I said. "See, that's why I'm calling." We talked for 2 hours that night. By the time I went to bed, the outline of a plan had taken shape, rough at the edges, but there. The kind of plan that starts as an instinct and gradually becomes architecture. Here is what I knew about Desmond. Even then, he had been watching me for a while. I found out later, months later, through Cornelius's connections, that Desmond had hired a private investigator roughly 4 months before the clipboard incident. The PY's job was to build a financial picture of me. What I owned, what I owed, what I was worth. The investigator was thorough. He found my old checking account. He found the P.O. box I used for correspondence. He found the Midland house, which was still in my name at that point. He filed a competent report. What he didn't find was the trust portfolio. In Texas, when a property is held by a private land trust, it is recorded under the name of the trust entity, not the name of the individual who established it. My trusts were registered under names like FRR Land Holdings and West Basin Asset Trust. No connection to Harlan Doyle in any public record. The investigator had no reason to look for them, and no way to find them if he had. Desmond paid for a report that told him approximately half the story. He thought he had a complete picture. He didn't. He never did. I want to tell you about a family meeting that happened 3 months after Flora's funeral. June of 2022. Desmond organized it, called it a family financial review, sent a calendar invite like it was a quarterly earnings call. 2 hours around a conference table in a hotel meeting room in Midland. Spreadsheets. A projected slide deck. 2 hours. Nobody asked how I was doing, not once. I sat there and I listened, and I watched my 3 children talk about money and property and asset management. And I thought about Flora, who had been in the ground for 93 days, and I thought this is what it was always going to come to. And then I went home and I sat in the kitchen and I thought about the napkin. My 64th birthday came and went the following spring. I bought myself a small cake from the bakery on Michigan Street Lemon because that's what Flora would have chosen. I sat at the kitchen table, lit the candles, and blew them out alone. I made a wish. It had nothing to do with my children. By September of 2022, the house in Midland was sold. I changed my phone number, closed the accounts they knew about, forwarded my mail to the P.O. box, and let the trail go cold. The day I sold that house, I wasn't running away. I was finally running towards something. I had been reading geological surveys of West Texas for 30 years, and I had found exactly what I was looking for. Reeves County, Texas. Population just over 15,000. The kind of place where the sky goes on forever and the ground keeps its secrets deep. I drove out on a Tuesday morning in late October of 2022, the highway cutting straight through scrubland that stretched to every horizon. The listing had been sitting for 14 months with no takers. 640 acres of dry grassland, caliche flats, and a stretch of rolling elevation that most buyers would write off without a second look. I got out of the truck at the gate and stood there a moment. West Texas wind came at me sideways, not cold, just insistent the way it always is out here, like the land was asking what my business was. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out the napkin. 41 years of folding and unfolding had made it soft at the edges, the pencil lines faded but still readable. I held it up against the landscape in front of me, the long slope to the west, the natural depression toward the northeast, sitting lower than the surrounding terrain, shaped exactly like a pond waiting to happen. The flat stretch along the south fence line where morning light would come in long and slow. The slight ridge along the eastern border where something with deep roots might grow in careful rows. It was not identical. Life is never identical to the sketch, but it was close enough that my chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. I folded the napkin and put it back in my pocket. Then I went to find the gate latch. On the northeast corner of the property, half hidden by dried brush, a flat piece of limestone jutted from the earth. Someone had carved into it letters worn by decades of sun, but still legible if you crouched down and looked straight at them. Earl W. Doyle Est. 1961. I stayed crouched there longer than I needed to. Doyle. I checked later, no family connection whatsoever. Just a name. Just a man who had worked this same ground 60 years before me and left 3 words on a rock. But I have learned, in 65 years of living, that sometimes the universe makes a point without bothering to be subtle about it. I called the listing agent from the truck and offered asking price. No negotiation. He sounded confused. Land in Reeves County doesn't move that way. I told him I'd have paperwork to him by Friday. Then I called Cornelius. By December of 2022, the property was held by the Flores Reach Heritage Trust, a legal entity registered with the Texas Secretary of State, with Cornelius Hatch, listed as trustee of record. My name appeared nowhere in the public filing. As far as any county database was concerned, the land belonged to a trust. The trust belonged to the paperwork, and the paperwork was airtight. On my first full morning at the ranch, someone knocked at 7:15. It was Theron Oglesby, the same man who had stood beside me at Flora's funeral without being asked, the one who'd driven 3 hours to be there and never explained why. He was holding 2 paper cups of gas station coffee from Pecos 40 minutes away. He held one out without a word. I took it. We stood on the porch together and looked at the land while the morning came in, which is the correct way to greet a West Texas sunrise. After a while, Theron tilted his chin toward the western field. "You know what's under there?" he asked, not suspicious, just direct. I took a slow sip of coffee. "I know enough not to sell," I said. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded the slow, deliberate kind that means something has been understood and filed away. Theron had worked land in Reeves County for 30 years. He'd seen oil leases signed and broken, watched neighbors sell cheap, and spend the rest of their lives regretting it. He didn't need things explained to him. He came back the next morning with 2 more cups. That's how it started. Over the following months, I hired 2 brothers from Pecos to help with the heavy work. Together, we shaped the Northeast Depression into a proper pond. I brought in lavender seedlings from a grower in the hill country and planted them along the western slope in long, deliberate rows. 10 Rambouillet sheep arrived from a ranch outside Fort Stockton. Sunflowers went in along the driveway. 7 Honeycrisp apple trees in the southeast corner, staked and mulched, stubborn-looking, the way young trees always are. Inside, Flora's apron hung on the hook by the stove. Her photograph sat on the mantel, the one from our 25th anniversary, her laughing at something just off camera. Every evening, after the animals were checked and the house had gone quiet, I'd look at it. "Sheep number 3 had a lamb today, Flora," I said one evening in early spring. "Named her Daisy." The house didn't answer, but saying it out loud made it feel like something shared, and that was enough. On an evening not long after, I stood on the porch with the napkin in my hand. Held it up the way I had at the gate on the first day. Looked from the paper to the lavender slope to the pond catching the last of the light. "I found it, Flora," I said. "I finally found it." But a man with 40 years of reading the earth doesn't buy land just for the view. I knew something was down there. I just needed someone else to confirm it. Spring came to Reeves County slowly that year. The lavender was 6 inches tall. The sheep had learned my voice, and Garrison Lowe was standing in my kitchen with a folder that changed everything. I had hired Garrison about 2 months after moving in quietly through a referral from an old colleague at the Petroleum Bureau. Garrison Lowe was 52 years old, an independent geophysicist with 30 years of fieldwork across the Permian Basin and no permanent affiliation with any energy company. That last part was the reason I chose him. I didn't want a report that belonged to someone else before the ink was dry. I wanted an honest read from a man with nothing to sell. He set the folder on the kitchen table without ceremony. "You want the short version or the long one?" he asked. "Give me the number first," I said. He opened the cover page. The figure was printed in plain 12-point font, the way serious documents always present serious things without drama, as if the number itself didn't need any help. $340 million. Estimated recoverable reserve value, Eastern Formation. Flora's Reach Ranch, Reeves County, Texas. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at Garrison. "Is that conservative?" I asked. "Middle estimate," he said. "Conservative is 280. Optimistic is just over 400. I nodded slowly. Closed the folder. "Enough to build a lavender garden," I said, "and keep a small flock of sheep." Garrison Lowe had spent 30 years delivering geological reports to oil executives, energy lawyers, and investment groups. He had, I imagine, heard a great many responses to large numbers. He had probably never heard that one. He looked at me for a long moment, not confused exactly, but recalibrating. "Mr. Doyle," he said carefully, "I think you already know the answer to that." "I do," I said. "I just wanted to hear it out loud." The negotiation with Lone Star Energy took 11 days. Cornelius handled most of it. He had dealt with energy companies for 30 years and had the particular patience of a man who knows exactly which kind of silence makes the other side nervous. My one condition was non-negotiable: the Eastern Formation would be developed. The western acreage, approximately 80 acres running along the slope where the lavender grew, would remain untouched. Permanently, written into the contract as a surface use restriction with no expiration clause. Lone Star pushed back. Their landman called twice. Their legal team sent a counter-proposal that quietly omitted the restriction language as if I might not notice. I noticed. Cornelius called them back. He used the word permanently 4 times in one paragraph. They signed the modified contract 3 days later. The western 80 acres was worth considerably less to them than the eastern formation, and they were businessmen. Businessmen understand arithmetic. There was one additional clause I had asked Cornelius to include. He had raised an eyebrow when I explained it, but he wrote it in without argument. The well would be named Flora's Well, officially. In all company documentation, all regulatory filings with the Texas Railroad Commission, all public records. Not a nickname, not an informal reference. The legal designation of record. Cornelius slid the final contract across the table and held out his pen. I signed it. That same afternoon, a boy appeared at the edge of my lavender field. He was maybe 9 years old, sandy-haired, wearing boots that were slightly too big for him. He was Theron's grandson, Bobby Oglesby, who came to visit on weekends from his mother's place in Pecos. He had a habit of wandering the property line when he was bored, and I had a habit of not minding. He was crouching over something near the fence post. When I walked over, he held up a rock, rough, reddish-brown about the size of his fist. "What kind is it?" he asked. I crouched down until I was at eye level with him. I turned the rock over in my hands, felt its weight, looked at the grain. "Iron-rich sandstone," I said. "See this color? That red comes from iron oxide in the mineral composition. It means the formation here has been oxidizing for a very long time." "Like rust," he said. "Come exactly like rust. The earth rusts too, just slower." He considered this with the seriousness that 9-year-olds bring to information they've decided is worth keeping. "Is there oil under here?" he asked. "Under some of it," I said. "But you're growing flowers on it." "I am." He looked at the lavender rose for a moment, then back at me. "That's a good trade," he said. I handed him back the rock. "Keep it," I said. "That's a piece of West Texas history you're holding." He tucked it into his jacket pocket and walked back toward Theron's fence line with the careful pride of a boy who has been given something real. That evening, I sat in the armchair in front of Flora's photograph, and I stayed there a long time without speaking. The house was quiet. Outside, the lavender was settling into the dark, and somewhere in the eastern field, the ground held its $340 million secret, the same way it always had, without drama, without announcement, the way the earth keeps everything it's been trusted with. "They'll call it an oil well, Flora," I said finally. "The industry men, the lawyers, the engineers, they'll talk about barrels and reserves and extraction rates, but I named it Flora's Well because of what it really means. Not what's underneath the ground, what's above it. Everything we built, everything we dreamed." I looked at her photograph, the one where she was laughing at something, just off frame. "Everything is well, Flora," I said. Finally, everything is well. The contract was signed. The well was named. And I thought foolishly, perhaps, that the hard part was over. I didn't know that 600 miles away, someone had just found a 5-year-old geological survey with my name on it, and that someone was my son. I want to tell you something about greed. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock on your door with a warning. It arrives quietly, disguised as concern, dressed up as family obligation, wearing the particular expression of someone who believes they are simply collecting what they're owed. And sometimes it arrives in a 15-second Instagram video. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early May of 2024. I was in the eastern field checking fence line when my phone rang a number I didn't recognize, area code 432. West Texas. I almost didn't answer. Mr. Doyle. The voice was calm, professional, with the particular directness of someone who asks questions for a living. My name is Miriam Oates. I'm an investigative journalist based in Midland. I've been working a story on land fraud in the Permian Basin for the past 4 months, and I think you need to know something. I stopped walking. How did you get this number? I asked. Cornelius Hatch gave it to me, she said. After I explained what I found, I stepped out of the sun and leaned against the fence post. Tell me, I said. Mr. Doyle, do you know your daughter just told the world exactly where you live? Miriam Oates was 37 years old, a staff reporter for the Permian Basin Courier who had spent the last 4 years covering mineral rights disputes, fraudulent land transfers, and what she called, with the dry precision of someone who had seen too much of it, the quiet theft of West Texas. She had been tracking Desmond Doyle for 4 months, after a tip about a series of suspicious deed filings in Acre County. 3 days before she called me, Vivian had posted to her Instagram account a short video, 15 seconds, maybe 20, filmed at golden hour, the kind of light that makes even dry Texas scrubland look like a painting. The lavender rose in the background, the pond catching the sunset, the gatepost with the property sign visible if you knew what you were looking for. Vivian had tagged the location. Not precisely just the county, but she'd filmed it standing at the top of the western slope, and in the background, barely visible, was the carved limestone post at the northeast corner of the property. A detail no one would notice unless they already knew what Earl W. Doyle's stone looked like. Desmond apparently had known, but that wasn't the part that mattered most. Miriam had reviewed the video 3 times, zooming in on the frame where Vivian panned left. In that 2-second sweep, a man was visible at the tree line Desmond, standing with a folder tucked under his arm. Miriam had enlarged the frame until the label on the folder tab was legible. Flora's Reach Occupancy Transfer Filing. That's a fabricated document, Miriam told me. It's designed to look like an official transfer of occupancy rights, the kind of paperwork that, presented to a sheriff's deputy by someone who sounds confident enough, might create enough confusion to allow entry onto a property. It has no legal standing, but it doesn't need legal standing to cause trouble. I had not moved from the fence post. He's been planning this, I said. It wasn't a question. For at least 4 months, she said. Possibly longer. He used a preliminary geological survey from 2018 obtained, from what I can determine, through a former intern at a geotechnical firm you were once affiliated with. The intern was paid to pull the file. The survey is incomplete. It covers the western formation only, and the data on the eastern field is absent. Your son knows there's oil on this property. He does not know how much. He does not know you've already contracted it. There it was, the shape of what Desmond understood and the shape of what he didn't. He had half a picture and a folder full of fabricated paperwork. He thought he was walking into an old man's ranch to take something that hadn't been claimed yet. He had no idea the claim had been filed, sealed, and named after his mother. Miss Oates, I said, how would you like to be part of the most important story you've ever written? A brief pause. When she spoke again, the professionalism was still there, but underneath it, something else. The particular alertness of a journalist who has just realized the source knows more than the story. Tell me what you have, she said. I told her enough. Not everything, not yet, but enough that by the time we hung up 40 minutes later, Miriam Oates understood she wasn't just reporting on a land fraud case. She was watching a trap close. That night I called Cornelius. The conversation was short. It's time, I said. I'll pull the files, he said. How long do we have? 6 months. maybe a little less. That's enough, he said. And I believed him. After I hung up, I sat in the armchair in front of Flora's photograph and looked at it for a long time. They found us Flora, I said. Right on schedule. Outside, the lavender was still. The sheep had settled for the night. The eastern field sat quiet over its $340 million secret, patient the way the earth always is, waiting for the right moment, the right question, the right man to finally ask it. What none of us knew yet was that Desmond wasn't coming alone, and he wasn't coming to talk. I found that out 11 days later from the last person I expected to hear from. The first warning came from the last person I expected. Not a lawyer, not a neighbor, not a journalist who had been tracking my son's paper trail for 4 months. It came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, from a number I didn't recognize, and it said 7 words. They're coming November 18th. Please be ready. I sat up in bed and read it twice. The house was dark. Outside, the lavender was silver in the moonlight, the way it gets on clear November nights, when the temperature drops fast and the air goes still. I held the phone and looked at those 7 words for a long time. Then I typed back, "Thank you, Priscilla." 30 seconds passed. Then, "How did you know it was me?" I thought about that for a moment before answering. "Because you're the only one in that family with a conscience left." Another pause. Longer this time. I should have spoken sooner. I looked at those words on the screen and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not strategy, but something quieter, something close to sorrow. "You're speaking now," I wrote back. "That's enough. I want to tell you about Priscilla Doyle because she deserves to be told about properly. She was 39 years old, a 3rd-grade schoolteacher in Odessa, the same grade Flora had taught, which is a coincidence I have never fully known what to do with. She had married Desmond 11 years earlier, and from everything I had observed over those 11 years, she was a decent woman who had made an imperfect choice and spent a decade quietly managing the consequences of it. She was not loud. She was not dramatic. She had Flora's quality of precision without Flora's particular warmth, more guarded, more careful, the way people become when they have learned that openness costs something. She had 2 children with Desmond. She coached a girls' soccer team on Saturday mornings. She sent me a card every year on my birthday, handwritten brief, always the same sentiment in different words, thinking of you. Desmond didn't know she sent them. I was fairly certain of that. What she had witnessed in the weeks leading up to that text message I could only partly imagine. A husband rehearsing arguments, documents spread across the kitchen table at night, phone calls taken in the garage. At some point she must have seen the date written on a folder cover or spoken aloud on one of those garage calls, the kind of detail a careful woman files away without letting on that she has. The particular atmosphere that fills a house when someone is planning something and doesn't want to be asked about it. She had chosen to pick up her phone at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and type 7 words to a man her husband had spent 3 years trying to erase. That took more courage than most people will ever need to use. November 18th came in cold and flat, the way West Texas mornings sometimes do. The sky a uniform, pale gray, no wind, the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like held breath. I was on the porch with my coffee at 2:30 in the afternoon when I saw the first car turn off the county road onto my gravel drive. Then the second. Then the third. 3 vehicles, moving in loose convoy, slow enough to be deliberate. I recognized Desmond's rental, a black SUV, the kind that announces itself before I could make out the faces behind the windshield. I set my coffee down. I did not go inside. I did not reach for my phone. I just watched them come. Desmond stepped out first. He was wearing a charcoal coat, pressed trousers, Shoes that were wrong for gravel, the same instinct for surfaces that had made him 40 minutes late to his mother's funeral. He scanned the property with the particular look of a man appraising something he has already decided to own. And then I saw the tie, navy blue. A little faded at the knot from years of use, but unmistakably the same tie I had given him the morning of his college graduation, May of 2004, standing in a parking lot outside the ceremony hall in Lubbock, pressing it into his hands because he'd forgotten to bring one. He'd laughed and let me knot it for him right there in the sun. He was wearing it now. I don't know if it was deliberate or careless. I don't know which would have been worse. I felt something shift in my chest, quiet and brief like a door closing in a room at the far end of a long hallway. The first real pain of the day. Vivian climbed out of the second car, already holding her phone, her thumb moving across the screen. She looked up at the lavender slope, then at the pond, then at the house, with the rotating assessment of someone choosing a frame, not seeing the place, seeing its potential as a backdrop. Sawyer got out last. He stood beside the car door for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets looking at the ground. He didn't look up. Not at the land. Not at me. I walked down the porch steps and across the yard and stopped at the gate. The three of them stood on the other side of it. 10 feet of gravel and a wooden gate between us, me on one side, them on the other, the way it had been for longer than any of us wanted to say out loud. I looked at Desmond. I looked at Vivian. I looked at Sawyer, who still hadn't raised his eyes. And then I looked at the navy tie one more time, at the faded knot, at the 20 years of wear in the fabric, and I said nothing. Sometimes the most complete thing you can say is silence. Desmond cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, in the careful voice of a man who has rehearsed the opening. "We need to talk about the property." I held his gaze. "I know," I said. Desmond reached into his jacket and pulled out a document thick enough to make a sound when it hit the hood of his car. And I knew then this wasn't a visit. This was a filing. There is a particular kind of audacity that comes with privilege, the belief that paperwork delivered with enough confidence can rewrite reality. I had seen it before, in boardrooms and field offices and county courthouses, the way a man in a good coat will place a document on a table and let the weight of it do the arguing. It works sometimes, on people who haven't read the fine print, on people who don't know what the words actually mean. Desmond had not accounted for the possibility that I had spent 40 years reading fine print for a living. He laid the document on the hood of his SUV with the flat precision of a man who had rehearsed the gesture. A bound folder, maybe 30 pages, the cover page bearing the title in clean serif font. Family Property Management Agreement. Flora's Reach Ranch, Reeves County, Texas. Below it, a date. Below that, what appeared to be 2 signatures. One of them was supposed to be mine. "I want to walk you through this," Desmond said. His voice had the particular smoothness of someone who has decided that tone is a tool. Calm. Reasonable. The voice he used in meetings. I imagined the voice of a man managing a situation. "It's a shared-use agreement. It establishes joint family access to the property, long-term residency rights for designated family members, and a cooperative management structure for any undeveloped resource potential on the land." Resource potential. I noticed the phrase, careful, vague, designed to sound administrative rather than predatory. "Read it at your own pace," he said. "We're not in a hurry." I picked up the folder. I read it. Not quickly, carefully, the way I read anything that matters, starting from the definitions section and working forward. The language was dense and layered, the kind that takes a second read to understand and a third to catch what it's hiding. Whoever had drafted it knew what they were doing. The agreement purported to establish joint ownership rights derived from familial relationship and prior occupancy. A legal theory with no basis in Texas property law when the title is held by a trust, but plausible sounding to anyone who wasn't already familiar with how trust ownership actually works. Behind Desmond, Vivian stood with her phone raised at a slight angle, the ring of her camera visible at the edge of my vision. She wasn't filming the document. She was filming me reading it. Sawyer stood beside the second car, with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at a point somewhere between his feet and the gravel. He had not looked up since getting out of the car. I had been watching him the way you watch a person who is trying very hard to be somewhere else in their mind. I closed the folder. "Where did you get my signature, Desmond?" The question landed without inflection. Not angry, not alarmed, just a question requiring an answer. Desmond's jaw tightened by approximately 1 millimeter. The kind of tell that only registers if you've been watching someone's face for 42 years. "We have legal standing, Dad. The agreement was properly executed under—" "That's not what I asked." A silence opened up between us wide enough to drive one of his rental cars through. It was into that silence that the sound of gravel under tires arrived from behind me. I had not called Sheriff Trace Mullen that afternoon. I want to be clear about that. He arrived on his own in his department vehicle, pulling up the drive at the pace of a man who is not responding to an emergency, but is not in any particular hurry either. Reeves County Sheriff, 48 years old, 22 years in the department, the last 9 as sheriff. He had a reputation for being unhurried in a way that people occasionally mistook for slowness, until they realized he had already figured out what they were planning before they finished explaining it. He had also, approximately 6 weeks earlier, had a private conversation with Cornelius Hatch about a purely hypothetical scenario involving fraudulent trust document filings and the relevant provisions of the Texas Penal Code. A hypothetical that had been specific enough and detailed enough that Sheriff Mullen had made a quiet note in his calendar about the date of November 18th. He stepped out of his vehicle, nodded at me, and looked at the group assembled at the gate. "Afternoon," he said, with the economy of a man who uses words only when they earn their place. His eyes moved to the document folder on the hood of Desmond's SUV. "What have we got here?" Desmond shifted into his boardroom register, immediately composed, cooperative sounding, the kind of performance designed to make law enforcement feel like a formality rather than an obstacle. He explained the agreement. He used the phrase "family matter" twice. Sheriff Mullen picked up the folder. He read the cover page. He turned to the trust reference clause on page 4, which Desmond had buried in the definitions section, presumably hoping no one would reach it and read it again. "Beans are he said, looking at Desmond with the pleasant neutrality of a man who already knows the answer to the question he is about to ask. "Can you explain the trust structure referenced in this document? Because this property is held under Flora's Reach Heritage Trust, and this agreement references individual ownership." Desmond opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. It was, I will admit, the most satisfying pause I had witnessed in recent memory. Vivian moved forward from behind the car, and when she spoke, her voice had the particular tremor of a woman who has practiced the tremor. "Officer, our father hasn't been well. We're really worried about him. He's been living out here alone, and we just want to make sure he's—" I looked at her, not with anger, not with hurt, just directly the way you look at someone when you want them to understand without words that you can see exactly what they are doing. She stopped talking. Sheriff Mullen closed the folder and held it at his side. "I'm going to need everyone to step back from the property," he said. "If you believe you have a legal claim here, you're welcome to return with documentation that references the trust structure correctly signed by the trustee of record." Until then, this property remains under the jurisdiction of its registered holding entity. Desmond took the folder back. He held it against his chest for a moment, both hands flat against the cover like a man keeping something from falling apart. Then he looked at me, and he smiled. Not a defeated smile, not a humiliated smile. The quiet, recalibrating smile of a man who has just moved from plan A to plan B without breaking his stride. I had been expecting that smile for 6 months. Plan B arrived 40 minutes later in the form of a phone call. Not from Desmond. The call came from Cornelius Hatch. Sheriff Mullen's phone rang while he was still standing at the gate. He looked at the screen, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but the particular alertness of a man who has just received confirmation of something he already suspected. He held the phone so the screen faced outward for a half-second before answering, long enough for Desmond to read the name displayed there. Cornelius Hatch, Esquire. I watched Desmond's face in that moment. The color didn't drain from it dramatically. It wasn't that cinematic. It was subtler than that. A stillness. The specific stillness of a man whose mental map has just been redrawn without his permission. Sheriff Mullen answered and set the call to speaker without being asked. A deliberate choice. He wanted the conversation on record in front of witnesses, with no room for dispute afterward. Sheriff Mullen. Cornelius's voice was the same on speaker as it was in person, measured, unhurried, with the particular authority of a man who has spent 30 years being the most prepared person in any room he enters. I understand you're currently at Flora's Reach Ranch in connection with a property document. That's correct, Sheriff Mullen said. I drafted that trust myself, Cornelius said. Every clause, every filing. I am the trustee of record for Flora's Reach Heritage Trust, registered with the Texas Secretary of State. Any agreement purporting to convey use rights, occupancy rights, or management authority over that property without my signature as trustee is not worth the paper it's printed on. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a space completely the way water fills a container. Furthermore, Cornelius continued, I'd like to note for the record that approximately 3 months ago, an individual identifying himself as Desmond Doyle contacted my office requesting advice on, and I quote, helping an elderly family member manage assets more effectively. I declined to take the consultation. Professional reasons. A beat. I think those reasons are now self-evident. Desmond was looking at the phone in Sheriff Mullen's hand, with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not bluster, something quieter and more complicated, the expression of a man who has just understood, fully and completely, that someone has been several steps ahead of him for a very long time. Do you have any questions for me, Sheriff? Cornelius asked. Not at this time, Sheriff Mullen said. I appreciate the clarification. Of course, I'll be available if anything further is needed. The call ended. Sheriff Mullen pocketed his phone and looked at Desmond. Sir, he said, with the same unhurried courtesy he'd maintained throughout, I'm going to need you and your family to vacate the property access road. If you have a legitimate claim, you'll want to file through the appropriate civil channels with documentation that references the trust structure correctly. Desmond picked up his folder from the hood of the SUV. He smoothed the cover with his thumb, the same small gesture from before, almost reflexive, like a man straightening his tie before a meeting that has already ended badly. Then he looked at me. This isn't over, he said. Not as a threat. As a statement of fact, delivered with the flat certainty of a man who still has cards he hasn't played. I know, I said. He got in the car. The door closed with the solid sound of expensive engineering. The engine turned over. Vivian was already in the second car, her phone out, thumbs moving. By the time the convoy reached the county road, she had posted to her account, I found out later from Miriam, who monitored it as a matter of professional habit. The caption read, "Family Healing Journey." 12,000 likes within the hour. 14 comments asking about the lavender in the background. Sawyer was the last one to get into his car. He stood beside the door for a moment longer than he needed to and looked back at the property. Not at me, not at Desmond, just at the land itself. I don't know what he was looking for. Maybe he was trying to understand how a man could build something this quiet out of nothing but grief and patience. Then he got in the car, and they were gone. Miriam called 20 minutes later. "I just confirmed something about Desmond's company," she said without preamble. "You're going to want to hear this." "I'm listening," I said. "Not on the phone," she said. "Can I come out Thursday?" "I'll have coffee ready," I said. After I hung up, I stood on the porch in the cooling air and watched the last of the light leave the western field. The lavender had gone gray in the dusk, the way it does before dark, when the color drains out and the shape is all that's left. The first round was over, but I had been reading geological surveys long enough to know the first core sample is never the last. That night, I went through my security system. I checked each camera feed from the panel in the kitchen, the two mounted on the exterior fence posts, the ones with the clearest line of sight to the gate, and the driveway were dead. The feeds had gone dark sometime during the 40 minutes the family had been on the property. Someone had cut them on the way out. Someone who knew exactly which cameras mattered or thought they did. I found out later from the footage itself that it was Sawyer. Desmond must have given him the model number in advance. That was always how they divided the work Desmond planned Sawyer executed, and neither of them ever asked the other to explain why. Here is something I learned in 40 years of field work. The most dangerous moment is not when your enemy attacks. It is when they think they have made you blind. I sat at the kitchen table with 2 dead camera feeds on the monitor and a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. Outside, the night had settled fully over Reeves County, no wind, no sound except the occasional movement from the sheep pen and the low creak of the porch swing in the cold. The 2 exterior cameras, the ones mounted on the fence posts flanking the main gate, showed nothing. Black rectangles where the driveway used to be. I reached for the iPad on the counter. The app was already open. 3 feeds each running clean and uninterrupted, each time-stamped and uploading continuously to a private cloud server that Garrison Lowe had helped me configure back in March. The cameras were small, the kind designed to be weatherproof and inconspicuous, tucked into the crossbeams of the gate structure and the eave of the barn facing the yard. Not the cameras anyone would think to look for if they were focused on the 2 obvious ones mounted on the fence posts. The footage from 4:47 that afternoon was clear enough to print. Sawyer, moving along the fence line on the way back to the cars, unhurried hands still in his jacket pockets, and then stopping at the first post, reaching up with something small and dark in his hand and holding it against the camera housing for approximately 8 seconds. He did the same at the second post. Quick practiced, the movements of someone who had looked up the model number and knew exactly how to interrupt the feed. He never looked up. Not at the barn camera, not at the gate crossbeam. He was looking at the cameras he thought were the only ones that mattered. All 3 angles had his face. Clearly, I set the iPad down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Thank you, Sawyer," I said quietly to no one in the dark kitchen. Then I picked up my phone and sent the footage file to Cornelius. The utility company called at 8:47 that evening. A representative from my electricity provider, polite and cautious, explaining that a request had been submitted to transfer the account billing address and primary account holder name, and that the submission had triggered a manual verification flag because the new address on file didn't match any previous service location in my history. I asked her to read me the information that had been submitted. She read it. My old social security number, the one associated with my Midland address, which I had not used for any current account since 2022. My old street address, the name of my childhood dog, which had been the security question answer on accounts I'd held 20 years ago. Old information, the kind a private investigator might compile from credit history and public records. The kind a son might remember from years of watching his father handle paperwork at the kitchen table. I told the representative to reject the request, flag the account, and send me a written record of the attempt. Then I hung up and called Cornelius, who answered on the second ring and said nothing for a moment when I finished explaining. "I'll file the identity theft report with the sheriff's office in the morning," he said, "and we'll freeze the credit tonight. All 3 bureaus." "Already doing it," I said. "In Texas, a credit freeze is a legal right, free, immediate, and effective. Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. 3 separate calls, 3 separate confirmation numbers, 22 minutes total." When I was done, I wrote the confirmation numbers in my field notebook, in the handwriting I had used for 40 years of geological data, small, precise, permanent. The phone rang again at 10:15. I looked at the screen. The number was one I recognized, a Dallas area code, a number Desmond had used to call me twice in the past year, both times about money. I pressed record on the secondary app I had installed in September. A quiet beep, barely audible. Then I answered. "Desmond." "Dad." His voice was different from the one he'd used at the gate. The boardroom register was gone. What was underneath it was something raw, not quite anger, but adjacent to it. The voice of a man running out of moves and aware of it. "I want you to think carefully about what you're doing." "I'm listening," I said. "I have a doctor ready to sign," he said. "A full capacity evaluation, filed with the court." You understand what I'm saying? I understood exactly what he was saying. He was saying that if I didn't cooperate, he would initiate guardianship proceedings using a paid medical evaluation, a process designed in theory to protect vulnerable adults and weaponized in practice by people who understood how to make the paperwork move faster than the truth. "I understand," I said. "Then think about what makes more sense," he said. "For everyone." I let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. "Son," I said, "I've been recording this call." The line went dead. I set the phone on the table. The app showed the file had saved and uploaded automatically 4 minutes and 31 seconds, stored on the same cloud server as the camera footage, time-stamped and encrypted. And then I sat in the quiet kitchen on a cold November night, and for the first time in all of this, through the forged documents and the fake assessments and the Instagram stories and the cut camera feeds, I cried. Not because I was afraid. I was not afraid. I cried because I suddenly heard underneath Desmond's voice on that recording the ghost of another voice, entirely a boy of maybe 8 years old, sitting on the tailgate of my old truck after a field survey, holding a piece of sandstone in both hands, and asking me, "Dad, why does the rock have layers?" And I had told him about time and pressure, and the way the earth keeps a record of everything that ever happened to it. He had listened so carefully that day. He had been so interested in everything. I don't know when that boy became the man on the recording. I don't know at what point the layers got compressed into something I no longer recognized. I opened Flora's journal, the one I had started writing in after she passed, the one I filled with the small daily things I would have told her over coffee. I picked up the pen. "Flora," I wrote. "Desmond called tonight. I don't recognize his voice anymore. By morning I had a recording, 3 counts of attempted fraud, and a file thick enough to bury someone. What I didn't have yet was the last piece. Miriam brought it the next day at 10 in the morning in a dusty Subaru. Miriam Oates drove up to Flora's Reach at 10 in the morning in a dusty Subaru with a press badge on the dashboard and a folder on the passenger seat that was 3 inches thick. She didn't knock so much as appear at the screen door, the folder already under her arm, her eyes doing the quick professional sweep of someone who catalogs rooms as a habit. She had the look of a person who had been awake since 5 and didn't particularly mind it. "Coffee's on," I said, stepping back to let her in. She set the folder on the kitchen table and sat down across from me. But before she opened it, she reached into the side pocket and pulled out something else, a single folded newspaper, the kind printed on cheap stock that yellows faster than it should. She unfolded it and laid it flat on the table between us without a word. The Pecos County Courier dated March 14th, 2019. A quarter-page article below the fold, with a small photograph of men in hard hats at a groundbreaking ceremony. The headline read, "Regional Infrastructure Partnership Returns Record Yields for West Texas Investors." I looked at it, then I looked up at Miriam. She folded her hands on the table and asked the question simply, the way good journalists do without loading it. "Did you invite your son into this project?" "Yes," I said. And he refused. He said it was too speculative, said I was throwing good money at a long shot. I looked at the photograph again. I was in it third from the left, squinting into the sun. I looked younger than I remembered feeling that day. He told me I didn't understand modern investment structures. Miriam nodded slowly. "Do you know what this project returned per partner by the time it closed?" $43 million, I said. She picked up the newspaper, folded it once, and placed it into the front of the folder without saying another word. The gesture was complete. It needed nothing added to it. She opened the folder. What Miriam Oates had assembled over 4 months of investigation was, I realized, as she walked me through it, not just a file on Desmond. It was a pattern. 6 properties across 3 West Texas counties, deed transfers initiated through shell entities, title disputes filed, and then quietly withdrawn. Elderly landowners who had signed documents they later claimed not to understand. 2 had already sold. 1 had died before the case could be resolved. The others were still in the middle of it. Flora's Reach was the most recent and the most ambitious. He escalated with each attempt. Miriam said, turning pages with the same measured pace she used for everything. Earlier targets were smaller parcels, simpler titles. "What you have here is more complex, a trust structure, mineral rights already contracted. A property that's increased in potential value significantly since he first identified it. He got more sophisticated as he went." "Or more desperate," I said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. She had corporate filings, bank records obtained through public disclosure requests, correspondence between Desmond's company and the attorney who had drafted the fraudulent family property management agreement. The attorney's name was in the file. He was not, it turned out, a Texas licensed attorney. He held a law degree from a state where he was no longer in good standing. "This goes beyond civil fraud," Miriam said. "Multiple victims coordinated scheme-forged legal documents. That's federal territory." I didn't say anything to that. I just looked at the papers spread across my kitchen table next to Flora's apron, hanging on the hook by the stove next to the coffee cups, next to the small ceramic rooster Flora had bought at a market in Fredericksburg in 2009, and refused to explain the appeal of ordinary things. The furniture of a life. My phone rang. Garrison. "Tell her the feeds are clean," he said when I answered. "All 3 cameras. Continuous upload, no gaps. The footage of the gate activity from the 18th is archived and time-stamped. I've already sent a copy to Cornelius." "She heard that," I said. "Good," Garrison said and hung up. Miriam raised an eyebrow. "My geophysicist," I said. "He also set up the security system." Of course he did, she said, with the tone of someone who has stopped being surprised by this particular man's level of preparation. We sat there for another hour. She asked questions. I answered them. Some of what I told her she already knew. Some of it filled in gaps she hadn't been able to reach from the outside. By the time we were done, the folder had grown pages I'd added from my own files, copies of the recording from the previous night, the utility fraud documentation, Cornelius's trust records. At some point, the folder stopped being just Miriam's and became something shared. Evidence. A complete account. I looked at everything on that table, 40 years of work, 3 years of grief, 6 months of planning, and the photograph of Flora on the mantel above the fireplace, looking down at all of it with the expression she wore in that picture, the one where she was laughing at something just outside the frame. Flora, I thought. I think we're ready. Miriam closed the folder. She looked at me across the table. When they come back, she said, I want to be there. You will be, I said. After she left, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching her Subaru disappear down the gravel drive toward the county road. The lavender rows ran in long lines down the western slope, gray-green in the November light, bare of color, but still standing. Still there. There was one thing left to do, and I needed to do it alone in the dark, in the middle of a lavender field that hadn't bloomed yet. I needed to talk to Flora one last time before it all began. It was past midnight when I walked out into the field. Thanksgiving was 12 hours away. The lavender was knee-high. 4 months of growth in West Texas soil, still young, the stalks thin and slightly silver in the moonlight, not yet the dense purple rose they would become by summer. The kind of young that still needs time. I walked between the rows, slowly, my boots finding the bare earth between the plants. The cold air carrying the faint green smell that lavender has before it blooms. Not yet the full fragrance, just the suggestion of it. A promise the plant is making to anyone patient enough to wait. I sat down at the center of the field. The ground was hard and cold. I didn't mind. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the napkin. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my flannel jacket and took out the pencil. It was small, worn down to about 3 inches, the wood smooth, where Flora's fingers had held it, at that diner in Lubbock in 1983. I had carried it in the same section of my wallet as the napkin for 41 years. The graphite tip had dried and dulled from age, so I had taken a moment before coming outside to draw the blade of my pocket knife lightly across it, just enough to bring the point back. Pencil graphite doesn't expire. It just waits. I unfolded the napkin carefully in my lap and held it up to catch the moonlight. Flora's lines were pale now, 41 years of folding and warmth, and the particular humidity of a man's chest pocket had faded them almost to whispers. The farmhouse, the lavender field along the slope with her question mark, the pond, the swing, the 10 small shapes that were sheep or clouds or both, the apple trees she'd drawn in the corner with 3 strokes each. In the bottom corner, someday, I looked at the lavender rows stretching out around me in every direction. The real ones, the ones I had planted row by row in the cold of January, with 2 brothers from Pecos and a diagram I'd sketched from memory of what the sketch had shown. Not identical. Life is never identical to the sketch, but close enough in the moonlight to take the breath out of a man. I placed Flora's pencil against the paper. The new line was slightly darker than the old ones. The graphite fresher, the pressure of a different hand, a different decade. I drew a small circle around the lavender field. Just an outline, just a border around the thing she had labeled with a question mark 41 years ago, as if to say, not a question anymore. Then I wrote 4 words beneath it in my own handwriting next to hers. It's blooming next year, Flora, I promise. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the cold to work its way through my jacket. long enough for the sheep in the western pen to settle into their nighttime quiet, long enough for the memory to arrive the way memories do when you stop trying to hold them back. Not as images exactly, but as presence, as the particular weight of someone sitting beside you in a room they are no longer in. I heard her voice the way I always hear it now, not out loud, but precisely. The way you hear a piece of music you know so well that your mind plays it note perfect from the inside. Don't let them make you small, Harlan. Her voice from a February morning, 14 months before she died. Both of us still in the bed, with the curtains she'd hung in, 1998, the pale winter light coming through the fabric. She had said it without preamble, the way she said things that mattered, as if they had been waiting in the room, and she was simply giving them a place to land. You were never small. Don't start now. I hadn't answered her that morning. I'd just taken her hand under the blanket and held it, and she'd let me, and we'd stayed like that until the light changed. I thought about Bobby Oglesby, standing in the lavender rose 3 months ago, with a piece of sandstone in his hands, asking me, "What does the earth say to you?" The question had stopped me cold when he asked it. Not because it was a child's question, because it wasn't. Because I had heard that exact question before, the same words, the same tilt of the head, the same earnest waiting for an answer from a 9-year-old girl standing on my shoulders in a field in Wyoming in 1994, pointing at a formation outcrop and asking Daddy, "What does the earth say to you?" I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the photograph. I had brought it with me tonight, deliberately knowing that tomorrow I would see her again, and that the woman I would see would not be the child in this picture, and that I needed to hold the distance between those two things in my hands before morning came. The photograph showed a summer day in Wyoming. Harlan Doyle, 35 years old, squinting into the sun, with a small girl sitting on his shoulders, her hands gripping his hair, her face completely open with the particular fearlessness of a child who trusts absolutely that the person beneath her will not let her fall. Vivienne, 9 years old, asking about the earth. I looked at it for a long time under the moonlight. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in my pocket. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the looking hadn't already said. I stood up slowly, the cold having settled into my knees the way it does at 65. I folded the napkin, new line and old line together, 2 pencils, 2 hands, 41 years, and put it back in my shirt pocket close to where the heart is. I slipped Flora's pencil in beside it. Then I walked back through the lavender rose toward the house, the dry stalks brushing against my jeans, the sheep quiet, the stars, doing what Texas stars do in November, filling the whole sky without apology. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and opened Flora's journal to the next blank page. "Tomorrow, Flora," I wrote. "It ends tomorrow." At 5 o'clock the next afternoon, 8 people sat down together in a dark house and waited. I had spent 6 months building a trap. In 4 hours, my children would walk straight into it. I just didn't know yet that one of them had been sitting in that dark house with us all along. Before I show you what happened inside that dark house on Thanksgiving night, comment the word "ready," so I know you're still with me. Because what comes next is the part I've been building toward for 6 months. And so have you. A note before we continue. The chapters ahead contain fictional elements crafted for storytelling purposes. Some details have been shaped for the narrative. If that's not for you, this is a good place to stop. But if you're staying, I promise it's worth it. Thanksgiving Day, November 28th, 2024, 5 in the afternoon. Flora's Reach Ranch was completely dark from the road. No porch lights, no windows glowing, no sign of occupation, no vehicles in the yard, no smoke from the chimney. That would have been the most natural thing in the world on a cold November evening. From the outside, it looked empty. It was the furthest thing from empty. We had come in from Theron's property, 8 of us on foot, single file along the fence line between his land and mine, starting at 4 in the afternoon, while the sun was still low and the shadows long enough to cover movement. Our vehicles were parked in Theron's barn, out of sight from the county road. No tire tracks in my driveway. No unfamiliar silhouettes in my yard. As far as anyone approaching from the road could see, Flora's reach had been abandoned for the holiday. That was the point. Inside, nobody spoke above a murmur. The house had the particular quality of silence that comes from people who understand why silence matters. Not the uncomfortable silence of people with nothing to say, but the operational silence of people waiting for the right moment to say everything. Cornelius Hatch sat at the dining table with 3 folders arranged in front of him. Working through the last of his notes by the dim light of a small flashlight he held at an angle so it wouldn't reach the windows. The folders were organized in the order he expected to need them. The forged family property management agreement, with the annotated discrepancies he had catalogued over 6 months. The recording from the night of the 18th, already formatted for evidentiary submission. And Miriam's compiled investigation file, which now included statements from 2 of the other fraud victims and the corporate filing discrepancies from Desmond's company. Sheriff Trace Mullen stood near the front window, flashlight off, watching the gravel drive through the gap between the curtain edge and the frame. He had positioned himself at the angle that gave the widest view of the approach, while keeping him invisible from outside. He had been doing this for 22 years, and it showed the stillness of a man who knew how to make himself part of a room. In the hallway leading to the back of the house, Deputy Ray Holt, Mullen's deputy for the past 4 years, a quiet man of 36 who had the useful quality of being easy to underestimate, stood with his back to the wall and his hands at his sides watching the interior. His job tonight was simple. If someone needed to be detained, he would be the one to do it. He was good at that part. Garrison Lowe had his laptop open on the kitchen counter, the screen tilted low. 3 camera feeds ran simultaneously: the barn eave, the gate cross beam, the northeast corner post. All clean, all uploading in real time to the cloud server. He checked the signal strength without being asked, the way engineers check things, not because they are uncertain, but because certainty requires verification. Miriam Oates stood near the front door, her phone in her hand, already in camera mode, battery at 100%. She had a notebook in her jacket pocket, and the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular story for 4 months and is now 40 minutes from it. Theron sat in the corner of the living room in the armchair that had been mine before I'd moved it, to make space for Cornelius's table setup. He held a cup of coffee that had been cold for an hour. He didn't seem to mind. He had the ease of a man who has learned over a long life that the waiting is part of the work. He looked across the dark room at me, and he said very quietly, "Same feeling as 30 years ago." I looked at him. "When your son tried to take your land?" I asked just as quietly. "When I sat in my truck outside the county clerk's office for 4 hours waiting for them to open," he said, "knowing I had the paperwork, knowing it was going to be fine, still not being able to make my hands stop shaking." He looked down at the cold coffee. "They stopped eventually." I nodded. That was all either of us needed from the conversation. And then there was Priscilla. She was in the back bedroom, the one Flora had imagined as a guest room, when she drew the farmhouse on the napkin, the one I had furnished with a bed and a reading chair, and a lamp I never turned on. Priscilla had arrived at Theron's property at noon, 6 hours before the rest of us, having told Desmond she was spending the holiday with a colleague from school. She had driven 4 hours from Odessa in a car Desmond had never seen, parked it in Theron's barn, and sat at Theron's kitchen table drinking tea until it was time to walk over. She knew everything. More than anyone else in the house, except Cornelius, because she had lived inside the plan from the other side, had watched it being assembled by her husband, without understanding until she did, that she was watching a crime being committed against an old man who had once tried to teach his son how to read the earth. She had something in her jacket pocket that she hadn't told me about. A small envelope sealed. She had mentioned it to Cornelius that afternoon quietly, and he had nodded and told her to hold on to it until the right moment. I didn't know what was in it. I didn't ask. Cornelius told me later that he'd asked her to wait, that some things land differently in the morning, after the noise has cleared, and a man is standing alone with his coffee and the quiet. I poured a measure of whiskey into the glass on the side table and set it down without drinking it. Then I picked up the stopwatch from the armrest. The room was completely still. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the lavender rose with the low sound of breath. Inside, 8 people waited in the dark, each with a role, each with a reason, each with the particular stillness of someone who has done everything that could be done and is now simply present for what comes next. 7:13. I looked at Cornelius. The soft ping of the motion sensor broke the silence, barely a sound at all, but in that room at that moment, it landed like a bell. 7:14. He looked back at me. "Right on time," he said. "Greed always is," I said. Through the front window, I counted 3 sets of headlights moving up the drive, except they weren't headlights. They were shapes. 3 cars moving in the dark, with no lights on, feeling their way up my gravel driveway in the last of the November dusk. 3 cars, no lights. That told me everything I needed to know about how innocent they believed they were. People who drive up a private road at night without their headlights on are not people who believe they have the right to be there. I watched them from behind the curtain, edge the same angle Sheriff Mullen had used for 2 hours. The 3 vehicles came up the gravel drive in a loose line, moving slowly. Their engines barely above idle, the careful approach of people trying not to announce themselves to a house they believed was empty. They pulled into the yard and stopped, engines cutting one by one doors, opening into the cold Thanksgiving dark. Desmond stepped out first. He was wearing a charcoal vest over a white dress shirt, the kind of outfit that says professional authority, without quite saying formal. The folder was under his left arm. He scanned the property the way he had on November 18th, with the appraising sweep of a man taking inventory of something he has already decided belongs to him. Then he said something low to the other 2, a short instruction, 2 or 3 words, and they moved. Vivian came out of the second car in a red velvet dress, the kind you wear to a holiday dinner, not to walk across a dark ranch yard in November. She had the tripod collapsed under one arm and her phone already unlocked in her other hand. She set up the tripod in the time it took Desmond to check his folder, snapped her phone into the mount, and began recording before she had fully straightened up. She moved toward the house along the sunflower path. The sunflowers were tall this time of year. Past their peak, the heads heavy and dried, the petals gone to seed, but still standing in their rows along the driveway, the stalks shoulder-high, pale gold in the moonlight. Vivian walked between them with the tripod, her phone recording the viewfinder catching the rows on both sides. She stopped. 1 second, maybe 2, the tripod motionless, the camera still running. Later, Garrison showed me the timestamp on that moment, 2 seconds. 14 frames of footage in which Vivian Doyle stood completely still between the sunflower rows and looked at something that wasn't the camera. I don't know exactly what she was seeing, but I know that Flora planted sunflowers on the balcony of every apartment we lived in, Boston Midland, the little rental in Odessa the year before we bought the house, every single year. In whatever container she could find, facing whatever direction caught the most light. Vivian had grown up with those sunflowers outside whatever window she looked through. She hadn't thought about that in years, probably. But the body remembers what the mind has filed away. 2 seconds. Then she picked up the tripod and kept walking. The camera on the barn eave caught all of it. Sawyer was last out of the third car. He was wearing a flannel jacket and work boots, the only one of the 3 dressed for what they were actually doing. He carried the Milwaukee M18 in his right hand, the battery pack already seated, the way you carry something you've handled enough to be casual about. He walked to the iron gate at the perimeter fence without looking at the house. The chain took him 23 seconds. I counted. The cutter made the sound. It makes a sustained mechanical whine that cut through the night air, and then the chain dropped, and the gate swung inward, and the three of them moved into the yard proper. Desmond led. Vivian followed with her tripod. Sawyer came last. At the front steps, Desmond paused and looked up at the dark house with an expression I recognized from board meetings and depositions and every negotiation he had ever described to me over the years. The expression of a man on the verge of closing something. He turned to Sawyer and lowered his voice, not a whisper, just the particular register of a man who believes no one else is within earshot. "Cut it," he said. "The old man has no idea we're here. By the time he finds out, it'll all be ours." I heard it through the wall. Every word. In the living room behind me, nobody moved. Sheriff Mullen's jaw tightened by 1 degree. Cornelius set down his pen with the quiet deliberateness of a man adding a final piece of evidence to a file that was already complete. Garrison's eyes went to the laptop screen, all 3 camera feeds running clean, all of it uploading in real time. Miriam raised her phone slightly higher. Sawyer stopped at the base of the porch steps. He stood there and looked around. Slowly, the way you look when you are actually seeing something rather than assessing it. The lavender rose on the western slope silver-gray in the moonlight. The pond at the northeast corner still and reflective, catching the stars. The sheep pen, the animals quiet inside their shapes, visible through the slat fence. The dried sunflower heads along the path behind him. He turned back to Desmond. "Des," he said, low, almost flat. Desmond was already on the porch, the folder open, checking something. "What?" he said without looking up. "Let's go home." Desmond looked up then. He looked at his brother for a moment, with the particular expression of someone who has already calculated the weight of another person's hesitation and found it manageable. "When you want your 80,000 back," he said, "keep moving." Sawyer looked at him. Then he looked at the ranch, the whole of it, the pond and the lavender and the dark house with its stone fireplace chimney and the porch swing hanging still in the cold air. Then he looked back at Desmond. 10 seconds. The longest 10 seconds I have ever watched pass on a security feed. Then he raised the Milwaukee M18 and placed the blade against the deadbolt housing on the front door. The sound it made was different from the chain, higher, sharper, the sound of something being forced that wasn't designed to be forced. It lasted 8 seconds. In the living room, I felt the vibration of it through the floorboards. Then the bolt gave. The door swung inward. Desmond put his hand against it and pushed it open all the way and stepped across the threshold into the dark entry of Flora's Reach Ranch. His father's house on his father's land, on a property held in a trust his father had spent a year making unassailable, and in the darkness he smiled. "See," he said to no one in particular. His voice had the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent months imagining a moment and has finally arrived inside it. Nothing to it. He never even knew. The smile of a man who believes he has finally arrived somewhere. He had exactly 2 seconds of triumph. Then I turned on the lights. What happened in the next 3 seconds, I have replayed many times since the way you replay things that are both terrible and necessary. Desmond's smile did not fade, it collapsed. Not slowly, not gracefully, but all at once, the way a structure fails when the load-bearing element gives without warning. His eyes moved across the room in the rapid, involuntary sweep of a man whose mind is trying to process something it had categorically ruled out as impossible. Vivian made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the kind that comes before words when the body reacts faster than language. She took one step backward, her heel catching the edge of the doorframe, the tripod clattering against the wall. Sawyer didn't move at all. He stood just inside the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at his father, not at the room, not at the sheriff, not at Cornelius or Miriam or any of the 8 people now visible in the lit house. Just at me. And his face had the expression of a man who, somewhere beneath the fear and the shock and the cold arithmetic of consequence, had always known this was exactly how it was going to end. The old man had no idea, I said quietly. I said it once. That was enough. There is a moment in every trap when the door closes. It doesn't always sound like a slam. Sometimes it sounds like a light switch. The overhead lights came on at a level I had set deliberately, not full, not blinding, just enough. Enough to see faces, enough to see the room, enough for Desmond, standing 2 steps inside the front door with his folder and his winning expression, to take in what was in front of him and understand in a single sustained moment that the geometry of the evening had changed completely. He saw Cornelius first, then Sheriff Mullen, then Theron in the corner, then Garrison at the kitchen counter with his laptop, then Miriam phone raised already recording, then Deputy Holt in the hallway. Then he saw me standing at the foot of the stairs. 8 seconds of silence. The kind that has weight. Vivian had come in behind Desmond and stopped when he stopped. She was still holding the tripod. Her eyes moved across the room with the rapid inventory of someone who has spent years reading audiences, and they stopped on Miriam. I learned afterward Miriam told me herself, with the dry economy she used for everything that Vivian had once approached her, about a profile piece for a lifestyle publication, a personal branding story. Miriam had declined. The reason she gave was not enough substance to the narrative yet. Vivian had not forgotten that. Now she was looking at Miriam's camera and understanding exactly what kind of story was being recorded. She set the tripod down. She did not pick it up again. Sawyer stood just inside the doorway and did not move, and did not speak. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the floor. Desmond opened his folder. "Dad," he said, in the voice that had been calibrated for this moment, steady, reasonable, the voice of a man managing a situation. "I know how this looks. It looks exactly like what it is, Desmond." He absorbed that without visible reaction. "We came because we were concerned. The isolation out here living alone at your age. You came with a battery-powered lock cutter at 7 in the evening on Thanksgiving Day," I said. "The nearest neighbor is half a mile away. You turned your headlights off on a private road." I held his gaze. "Which part of that is concern, son?" His jaw tightened by the millimeter I had learned to read 40 years ago. "We have legal standing." Cornelius stepped forward from the table. He took the folder from Desmond's hands with the courteous firmness of a man who has been waiting 6 months for this specific moment. He opened it to the signature page and held it up toward the light, reading through his glasses. "I drafted the original power of attorney. This document was modified from," he said, "October 14th, 2013. Flora Doyle signed it in my office on a Tuesday afternoon. She wore a blue cardigan. She asked me whether the notary stamp would smear because the ink was still wet." He paused. "I remember because it made me laugh. She signed it to protect your father, not to grant access to his assets." He turned to page 4. "The notary stamp on this page is registered to an office that closed permanently in March of 2019. The witness signature block uses a typeface that wasn't commercially available until 2016. And your father's signature?" He pointed to the line without touching it. "Your father is left-handed. This signature leans right. Desmond's voice came out differently than before, harder, but with the first trace of fracture underneath. You can't prove intent. I took one step forward. Desmond, he stopped. I spent 40 years reading the earth, I said. You know what that teaches you? Everything leaves a record. Every pressure, every shift, every fault line. The earth doesn't lie. It just waits for someone who knows how to read it. I held his eyes. I've been reading you since you were 8 years old. Something moved across his face. He reached for the only ground he had left. Mao, this land is worth $300 million. And you're living out here alone with sheep and flowers when this family, 340, I said. He stopped. Garrison's final estimate was $340 million. You had the 2018 preliminary survey. It was missing the eastern field data. I looked at him steadily. The data I collected myself, on foot, over 4 months, before I ever called Garrison. I watched the understanding arrive in him. He had never had the complete number. He had built everything on an incomplete picture and had not known there was more he couldn't see. You could have shared this with us, he said. The control was going now. I could hear it the way you hear the first stress fracture in a load-bearing structure. This is family. 8 years ago, I said, I introduced you to a project in Pecos County. You told me, and I remember the exact words, Dad, you don't understand modern investment cycles. $43 million per partner, Desmond. Per partner. I waited. I never mentioned it again. Not once. The room was very quiet. You didn't come here because you're family, I said. You came here because you found out there was something valuable, and you assumed that because I'm 65 and I read physical newspapers and I keep sheep, I let the pause sit, you assumed I wouldn't see you coming. We're your children. His voice broke on the last word. Not performance. The real thing finally, after everything else, had been stripped away. I looked at him for a long moment. Then at Vivian standing without her tripod very still. Then at Sawyer who had not raised his eyes from the floor. Yes, I said. You are. The anger I might have felt was not there. What was there was older and quieter and much harder to carry. And I spent 40 years hoping that would mean something different than what it turned out to mean. Garrison turned the laptop screen toward the room. The document was simple, a contract header, a well designation, a date. Flora's Well, Lone Star Energy, May 14, 2023. Desmond looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't build this for the money, he said. Barely audible. Not to anyone in the room. Just a thing that had become true in his mind and needed somewhere to go. Cornelius answered him gently. No, he didn't. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something has been understood that cannot be ununderstood. Desmond stood in the middle of his father's living room with an empty folder in his hands. And for one moment only, I saw on his face the boy who had once asked me why the rock had layers. Then Sheriff Mullen stepped forward, and for the first time that night, Desmond Doyle had nothing left to say. A geological report means nothing without a deed, and a deed means nothing without a trust. Desmond had spent months acquiring the first. He had never understood the second. Sheriff Mullen read the charges in the same unhurried voice he used for everything. Not theatrical, not unkind, simply clear the way law sounds when it has been correctly applied. Forgery of a government instrument, breaking and entering, criminal trespass. identity theft, attempted fraudulent occupation of trust-held property. He read each count the way you read items off a list that has been carefully prepared and will not be disputed. Desmond stood completely still. I had expected something, a last argument, a final reframing, the boardroom voice making one more attempt to control the room. But there was nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides while Deputy Holt moved behind him, and he did not resist, and he did not speak. I think he heard Flora. I don't know how else to explain it. I think in that moment, standing in his father's living room with the handcuffs closing, he heard the voice he had been ignoring for years. The voice that had told him more than once, in the practical and unsparing way she had of naming things. Your father will never do anything without a reason, even when you don't understand it. She had said that to him. I know because she told me she had one evening on the phone, 6 months before she got sick. She'd been trying to explain me to him. She'd been trying for years. He understood it now. That was the part that couldn't be undone. Sawyer was next. He put his hands behind his back, without being asked, a small gesture, barely anything, but it meant something. When the cuffs went on, he turned his head and looked at me, just looked, across the room. Nothing performed, nothing calculated, just a 31-year-old man looking at his father with an expression I didn't have a name for, and still don't. I looked back. I didn't say anything either. But we both understood something in that exchange that would have taken hours to say in words, and probably still wouldn't have landed right. Some things only exist in the space between two people looking at each other and choosing not to look away. Deputy Holt moved him toward the door. Vivian held out her wrists herself. She didn't look at anyone when she did it. Not at Miriam, not at Harlan, not at the camera she had set down an hour ago. She looked at her own hands. The handcuffs clicked. And she cried. Not the way she had cried at her mother's funeral, full-face camera, ready grief shaped for a particular kind of reception. This was different. This was the cry that comes from somewhere that has nothing to do with audience, nothing to do with narrative, nothing to do with the caption you'll write afterward. There is no afterward in that kind of crying. There is only the moment. I think she was thinking about Flora. I think it came at her the way grief sometimes does not when you expect it, not when you've prepared for it, but at the most ordinary and most impossible moment. The click of a handcuff on a cold November night. And suddenly Flora at the bathroom mirror on a Sunday morning, small fingers working a ribbon into Vivian's hair saying, "Hold still, baby, I'm almost done." The particular smell of her mother's cardigan when she leaned in close. The last hug at an airport years ago that Vivian had not known in the moment was practice for every hug that would come after, because after Flora every hug was practice for that one. She cried without sound, her shoulders moving, tears running straight down without being stopped. There was no audience. For the first time and longer than she probably could remember, Vivian Doyle was just a woman in a room grieving something she couldn't frame or filter or post. Garrison looked away. Theron looked at the floor. Some moments are private even when they happen in front of 8 people. The door to the back bedroom opened. Priscilla walked out in the unhurried way of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it. She was wearing the same jacket she'd had on when she arrived at Theron's barn that morning, and she moved through the living room without looking at anyone until she reached the place where I was standing. Then she stopped, turned, and stood beside me. Desmond saw her. "Priscilla," one word, not a question, not an accusation, not a plea. Just her name said in the voice of a man who has run out of everything else and has arrived at the thing underneath all of it. She didn't look at him. She faced forward, stood straight, stood still. I did not speak either. There was nothing to add to what her stillness had already said. They walked them out through the front door, the door with the broken deadbolt, the frame still showing the fresh score marks from the cutter. Through the yard, past the dry sunflower stalks along the path, past the fence line and the gate with the cut chains still lying on the ground, past the lavender field, I stood on the porch and watched them go. 3 of my children walking single file through the pale rows of knee-high lavender in the November dark, the cruiser lights catching the stalks in brief red and blue, and then they were past it, and in the vehicles, and the lights were moving down the gravel drive. Miriam stood beside me on the porch, recording. She didn't say anything. This was not a moment for commentary. It was a moment for the record. The cruiser lights reached the county road, turned, and disappeared. Flora's reach went quiet. The sheep in the western pen, the pond holding the stars, the lavender in its rows knee-high patient, not yet blooming, the way it was always meant to be. I went inside, locked the door the broken deadbolt held well enough for one more night, and I sat in the armchair until the sky outside the window began very slowly to go gray. The quiet that settled over Flora's reach on the morning after Thanksgiving was a different kind of quiet. Not the held-breath silence of 8 people standing in the dark. Not the grinding quiet of a man sitting alone at a kitchen table waiting. This was the quiet that comes after something hard is finished, the kind the earth makes after a long rain, when the soil has taken in everything it needed and gone still. I was up before 6. I didn't set an alarm. My body simply knew. I pulled on my flannel shirt, poured water into the percolator, and stood at the kitchen window while the Texas sky turned from black to the color of a worn copper penny. The lavender rows caught the first light in a way that made them look like they were breathing. 4 months old, knee-high. They hadn't bloomed yet, but they would. Flora had always said patience was just love with a longer timeline. The knock came at exactly 6 o'clock. Priscilla stood on the porch in her coat. From the night before, her eyes carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who had not slept but had done a great deal of thinking. She held a plain white envelope against her chest with both hands, the way you hold something you've been meaning to let go of for a long time. "I should have called sooner," she said. "I should have done a lot of things sooner." "Come in out of the cold," I told her. She shook her head. "I can't stay. I needed you to have this." She held out the envelope. "Flora gave it to me 8 years ago. She said I'd know when it was time." I took it. We stood there for a moment, the 2 of us in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. "He's not a bad man," she said quietly. "He just forgot what a good one looked like." "I know," I said, and I meant it. I watched her car move down the gravel drive until the taillights disappeared behind the cedar ridge. Then I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the envelope. It was a Polaroid. Old, slightly faded at the edges, the kind of photograph that holds its colors the way memory holds its details, imperfectly, but honestly. In the picture, a man stood in a sunlit backyard, holding a little girl on his shoulders. The girl was 9, maybe 10, arms stretched wide, laughing at something just outside the frame. The man below her was grinning up at her like she was the best thing he'd ever seen. That man was me. That girl was Vivian. On the back of the Polaroid, in Flora's careful slanted pencil script, 4 lines. "This little girl loves her father so much. She just forgot how to show it. Don't give up on her, Harlan. Some things take longer to bloom." I set the photograph on the table beside the old napkin and the pencil. I sat there for a long time, not saying anything. At 7 o'clock, Theron's truck pulled into the yard, and I heard Ruth before I saw her. Ruth Oglesby was 64, a retired elementary school teacher from Fort Stockton, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it feel like the temperature had gone up 2 degrees without anyone turning on the heat. She came through the door, carrying a pot of chicken soup in one arm and a pumpkin pie in the other, with Theron behind her, holding a paper bag, and Bobby trotting in behind him, like a retriever who'd spotted something interesting. "Sit down," Ruth said. It wasn't a suggestion. I sat down. For the first time in 3 years, I ate breakfast at a table with other people. Ruth ladled soup into a bowl without asking if I wanted any cut a wedge of pie, and set both in front of me with the efficiency of a woman who understood that sometimes grief looks like an empty plate. Bobby, meanwhile, had already dug something out of his jacket pocket. He placed a rock on the table beside my bowl, reddish-brown, roughly the size of a golf ball, with a faint banding pattern that ran diagonally across its face. "Found it out by the east fence," he said. "Near the drilling markers." I picked it up. Iron-rich sandstone. The same formation I'd first identified in the soil samples back in the spring of 2023. The same rock that sat a few thousand feet above a reserve worth $340 million. "Good eye," I told him. He grinned. "Theron says I have your eye." Theron's right. By 8:30, Miriam's piece had gone live. Theron read the headline off his phone: "West Texas Family Fraud Case Exposes 6-County Land Scheme. Geologist's Hidden Trust Cited as Key Evidence." Within 2 hours, it had been shared across 14,000 feeds. A local florist left a bouquet of sunflowers at the front gate with no name attached. A veteran from Odessa mailed a handwritten letter that arrived 3 days later, 2 pages telling me he understood what it meant to build something no one else could see. The legal fallout moved the way geology moves slowly, then all at once. Desmond was arraigned in December of 2024 on charges of forgery, criminal trespass, and identity theft. By February, his development company had dissolved. 3 partners filed for bankruptcy protection. Vivian lost her remaining sponsorships in January after a second look at her content history. Sawyer accepted a plea agreement in the spring, 18 months of supervised probation, and a restraining order that kept him off the property. I did not comment to any reporters. I did not post anything. I let the documents speak. In the afternoon, Bobby and I walked the lavender rows while Theron and Ruth rested on the porch. The sun had come around to the west, laying long shadows across the field, and the air smelled faintly of soil and cedar. "What is the earth saying today?" Bobby asked. I stopped walking. I looked at the rows at the pond catching the late light, at the old ranch house with Flora's apron still hanging inside the kitchen window, where I'd put it the first week I moved in. "It's saying some things are worth protecting," I told him. "Even when it costs everything you've got." He was quiet for a moment, kicking at a clump of soil with his boot. Then he looked up. "Did it cost you everything?" I thought about Flora's napkin in my jacket pocket, the Polaroid on the kitchen table, the pencil stub I'd been carrying for 40 years. "It cost me plenty," I said, "but I still came out ahead." That evening, I sat at the kitchen table one last time and opened Flora's brown leather journal to the final page. I wrote slowly, the way you write something you want to last. "The ranch is quiet. The lavender will bloom in spring, I'm sure of it now. Priscilla brought your photograph. I kept it. Theron and Ruth came for breakfast. I did not eat alone. The boy found another stone from the east field. He is going to be fine, Flora. They all might be eventually, even the ones who forgot." I did not forget a single thing. I closed the journal, set it on the mantel beside the framed photograph of Flora in the garden, and walked out to the porch. The swing chair moved in the evening wind. I sat in it the way you sit in something you built yourself carefully, then all at once. Across the yard, the lavender rose held the last of the sunset. The pond was flat and silver. In the sheep pen, 3 Rambouillet ewes moved in slow arcs, unbothered by anything. Flora had said she wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere the world couldn't reach, unless she let it. I had found it. I just wished she could have sat in this chair beside me, but then again, maybe she was. A few minutes later, Bobby came out and leaned against the porch rail, still holding the sandstone rock in one hand. "You going to stay out here long?" he asked. "A while," I said. He nodded, set the rock on the rail, and went back inside. I looked at the stone. Iron-rich, patient, the kind of thing that had been waiting in the ground for about 120 million years before anyone thought to pay attention to it. Flora would have liked that boy very much. People call this a dad revenge story. Maybe it is. But sitting here on this porch, watching the lavender finally bloom, that's not how it feels from where I'm sitting. It feels like a family story about what happens when a man stops being seen by the people who were supposed to know him best and chooses to build something beautiful anyway. I believe God doesn't waste a man's quiet years. Every silent morning, every lonely breakfast, every seed pressed into cold West Texas soil, none of it was wasted. Here's what I'll tell you. Honestly, I am not the hero of this dad revenge story. I was a father who read the earth better than he read his own children. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until someone cuts your gate in the dark before you say what needs saying. The people at your table right now, tell them today. My honest opinion, no mineral contract, no dad revenge outcome is worth the years you could have spent differently. A family story doesn't have to end in a courtroom. But sometimes that's the only way the ground gets cleared for something new to grow. The lavender is blooming. Flora's well is running. This family story ends here. Yours doesn't have to end the way mine nearly did. If this moved something in, you drop a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It means everything. Heads up, upcoming stories contain fictional elements built purely for reflection and education. If that's not for you, no judgment. Step away, find what nourishes your soul, and return whenever you're ready.